Okay, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about cultural Marxism and critical theory. So last time we talked a little bit about classical Marxism and Karl Marx's life. It would have been nice if we could have ended our discussion there. Unfortunately, if you lived through the Cold War, as many of us did, you know that Marxism didn't die when he died. It metastasized into many other forms and many other theories. And so we're going to talk about one of those today, cultural Marxism. And the founder, or the progenitor of cultural Marxism, was a man named Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci was an Italian neo-Marxist. He called himself a neo-Marxist because he really diverged from Marx when it came to the revolution and how that revolution was going to take place. He saw himself as 180 degrees away from Marx on some of those positions. He was imprisoned in 1926 by the Mussolini regime. It appears the fascists in Italy didn't like Marxists any more than the Nazis did. And he spent more than 20 years in prison. While he was there, he wrote up to a little bit more than 30 notebooks that contained Marxist thought and analysis. Those notebooks really came in handy for later Marxists, and he inspired quite a few of them. In those notebooks, he extended the concept of class warfare beyond economics, where Marx saw that that was the primary locus of warfare against the proletariat or against the bourgeoisie. So he extended that concept to the oppressed versus oppressor classes in every area of society. He also greatly expanded Lenin's concept of hegemonic power. Gramsci did not like Lenin. He thought that he was ham-fisted, but he did agree with his perspectives as it related to cultural power. And we'll talk a little bit more about hegemonic power later. His approach to the revolution, like I said, very different from Marx's. He believed in a war of position, which essentially was attaining power within a culture, then creating a counterculture and helping the proletariat to understand exactly why they needed to reject that hegemonic culture that they were living in. Only then could you execute the war of maneuver that Marx advocated, that bloody revolution. So while Gramsci was in an Italian prison writing his notebooks, there were a group of scholars in Frankfurt, Germany, who were starting up the Institute for Social Research. And so that institute was attached to the Goethe University in Frankfurt. That university later received the moniker Karl Marx U because of all the Marxists that were studying there. They were inspired by Gramsci. He was writing his notebooks and some of that information was available to them. And they created something known as critical theory to further expand on Marxism, to explain why Marxist revolutions hadn't happened in capitalist countries, and to further expand existentialist thought in the West. There were three generations of scholars at the Frankfurt School. A few of the first generation are listed here. We're going to focus on Herbert Marcuse because he really is the nexus between the Frankfurt School and US academia. And we'll see later how that happened. So critical theory was the lingua franca for the Frankfurt School. It was a way of looking at Western society through a critical lens, but they also looked at socialism and Marxism as well. They did, though, adopt Marxism in general, the general principles. Their existentialist bent had them questioning the value, the existence of objective truth. And in their mind, knowledge was useless without social action. So their focus was on ways to improve the state of the oppressor class. Like I said, Marxism, Freudian thought, as it related to the sexual revolution, was a part of that, existentialism and post-structuralism. And so critical theory really took root in the US. It started at Harvard Law, in fact. So law schools were a part of adopting that mindset. And then that metastasized and evolved from critical theory to critical legal theory, and then on into critical race theory, critical gender theory, and critical feminist theory. So, and you can see on this chart how they have further decomposed. And what you're seeing here is a list of oppressor groups, or oppressed groups rather. And those oppressed groups within those forms of critical theory would be looking at the ways in which the oppressor class are oppressing them, and ways in which they can rectify that through societal change. So that really is the focus of those critical theories. So let's look at critical race theory in particular, because it's in the news lately. And this video will help us kind of understand some of the basics of critical race theory and the way they view the world.
You're in a conversation and someone says, since God cares about the oppressed, Christians should embrace critical theory because it's trying to eliminate oppression too. What would you say? Critical theory is one way our culture attempts to explain and confront power structures. Some Christians have embraced it as well. But what is it? To understand critical theory, we need to understand its two primary claims. First, everyone can be divided into two groups, those who have power and those who don't. Second, those who have power always oppress those who don't. But how do we know who the oppressed and who the oppressors are? According to critical theory, the categories of oppressor and oppressed are based on your group identity. Things like race, gender, religion, immigration status, income, sexual orientation, and gender identity determine whether we are oppressed or one of the oppressors. Of course, someone might be part of an oppressed group in one way, but one of the oppressors in another way. That's where the concept of intersectionality comes in. Intersectionality seeks to measure someone's level of oppression based on how many of these groups they identify with. For example, a black man is less oppressed than a black woman, who is less oppressed than a black lesbian. In critical theory, the degree to which you are oppressed determines your level of moral authority. The more categories of oppression someone identifies with, the more moral authority they have. As a result, the experience and perspective of a gay black woman is more valuable than the experience and perspective of a straight white man, regardless of what they have to say. And in the same way, the more oppressed someone is, the less moral responsibility they have for their actions. Those who aren't part of oppressed groups, straight white men, gain moral authority by surrendering to those who haven't, the oppressed. This is called being woke.
So that was a great video. Just a few more points by way of context for critical race theory. It was created at Harvard Law School by Professor Derek Bell, and it was expanded on by Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a legal scholar at Harvard as well. That term was coined by Ms. Crenshaw. Like cultural Marxism, it viewed all of life as a power struggle between the oppressor and the oppressed classes. And they rejected objective truth and rational thought. So that was their existentialist bent. Most importantly, they believed in storytelling and narrative, in addition to individual felt experiences, versus proof versus logic. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that factors in. All societal systems are seen as fundamentally racist because they were created by the oppressor class. And the only option is to dismantle those systems. And of course, unity is not possible between oppressed and oppressor classes. And so that's the very anti-Christian concept that we'll address in the next session when we talk about how Christians should respond to this ideology. On the right, you'll see phrases, all of which are tied to critical race theory, many of which you may believe you know the definition for. But one particular method in critical theory is these words that are common to us are redefined to match the ideology. So racism in critical theory is not racist acts against an individual. It's the water in which our society swims. Racism exists everywhere. And the job of the scholar is to determine how events are racist, not whether or not they are. Equality in their vernacular relates to egalitarian equality, equal outcomes for all people regardless of decisions. So how did this thought process, this ideology, make its way into our country? How has it continued to evolve? Many of us expressed surprise when the riots started just a few months ago. And surprised because we didn't see these kinds of things coming. But it has been several decades since the Long March began. And this concept was one of Gramsci's concepts, but it was evolved by a German student, Rudi Dutschke. And it basically says the way that long revolution occurs is through very discrete steps. And so if you look at this chart, the boxes that are called out are those discrete steps in serial form. And so critical theory is created in box 1. In box 2, we see the regression to pre-modern narrative. That's pre-written language storytelling, narrative, not facts, not logic, but stories. And so the next step, academia begins to embrace these principles. And I have that highlighted because in the next chart, we'll pull that thread. But for each one of these boxes, you could easily expand that and show what steps led to adoption or what steps led to these actions and who inspired those steps. Later, the civil rights era, we see arts and entertainment impacted, the sexual revolution begins. Feminism is on the rise, the LGBTQ agenda is on the rise. Many of these things occurred concurrently, not necessarily serially, but I believe that we're actually on the bottom row in our society today. We're seeing significant political division. Every societal institution is under attack. We're seeing civil unrest in our cities. We're also seeing nullification and denial. So that particular step happened prior to the Civil War, where states and municipalities began to reject the very concept of law and order, the very concept of federal guidance or federal restrictions, and began to make their own rules, essentially. And then the last step, of course, is national division. And none of us really want to see that occur. But this is the Long March. This is the process that Gramsci envisioned. So the academic connection ties back to Herbert Marcuse, who was our Frankfurt School member, also titled The Father of the New Left Movement by the 60s radicals. And ironically today, considered Antifa's favorite philosopher. So Marcuse focused on the cultural Marxist principles related to repressive tolerance. And so in his mind, no opposing view could be tolerated and should be violently shut down. He accepted the Freudian concepts of sexual freedom, which was the root of the free sex movement in the 60s. He believed in the non-existence of objective truth, very existential. And so those New Left protesters, using his principles and philosophies, sought to become the new proletariat. And in that role, they sought to pull down establishment structures. They advocated for feminism, for gay rights, for abortion rights, and for Black liberation. So in their mind, they were conducting warfare in support of the oppressed, and also their violent opposition to the Vietnam War. In that scenario, they were defending the oppressed in another country. So the Frankfurt School really is the nexus between continental Marxism and Marxism in the U.S. Academy. If you lay that on a timeline, and you can see here with the birth of Karl Marx all the way through the Russian Revolution, you can see the Frankfurt School being formed in Germany, and then 10 years later being ejected from Germany by the Nazi Party. At that time, Columbia University provided a landing spot for these scholars. And Columbia itself had a spin-off college that was specifically designed to accept scholars being ejected from Europe during World War II. And so most of the Frankfurt School members landed there. Later on, they moved out to Los Angeles. A few of them established an East and West Frankfurt School US body. And then Marcuse began to take up positions within academia. He taught at Columbia, he taught at Harvard, and then he taught at Brandeis in Boston. The New Left movement starts up at Berkeley in 1964. Marcuse moves from Boston out to UC San Diego, where he continues teaching his philosophy, his perspectives. And then you can see later in the 80s, Harvard Law School protests began over diversity. And that's where critical legal theory takes root. And then about 7 years later, critical race theory is spawned out of Harvard as well. So fast forward to today, the current academic focus is dominated in social sciences, arts, and humanities by these cultural Marxist philosophies, and legal studies as well, because critical legal theory came out of Harvard. But you don't see as much overt Marxism on campus as you did in the 60s. You do, however, see courses that all are connected back to critical theory and Marxism, like post-colonialism, gender studies, racial studies, diversity, anti-racism, and equality studies. So all of them at their core correlate to critical theory and critical race theory and the principles behind them. And unfortunately, it's not staying confined to arts and humanities and social sciences. It's now moving into the hard sciences. So math is seen, this was out of Brooklyn College, as a white supremacist patriarchy rooted system. And there's now a controversy, the 2 + 2 = 5 controversy at Harvard, where a Harvard PhD student is asserting that looking for formulaic answers to mathematical problems is a white Western construct and has to be changed. So what exactly is the end goal of cultural Marxism and the Long March? So all of these seemingly unconnected initiatives that we watched play out over the 60s and the intervening decades are connected to cultural Marxism. The ability to control the robes of society is a very Marxist concept. So academia, the judicial system, religious and political institutions have to be controlled before the message can be changed. Societal systems have to be reconstructed in order to favor the oppressed and to create an egalitarian construct. Elimination of all contrary perspectives. That repressive tolerance that Marcuse talked about is reflected in our current cancel culture. Deconstruction and reconstruction of history. Pol Pot's year zero concept, where all activities prior to the year of the revolution are invalid and erased, can be seen in projects like the 1619 Project, designed to rewrite US history. Of course, advancement of critical theory in every institution, in the workplace, in racial and gender quotas and workplace training has already been realized. So that's been in place for many years. And then the redefinition of the scientific method, medical science, and even hard sciences are seen as decolonization or decentering of Western epistemology is also an end goal. So most of us don't agree with this outcome and are shocked to hear where we are in our society. So how exactly should the church respond? How do we exhibit grace while we also exhibit the necessary strength to turn this around, to stop the advance of cultural Marxism? Well, that's a great question, and that's something that we're going to address in our next session. So see you then.